Welcome to a Little Wayward podcast coming out of St. Therese Institute of Faith and Mission. How are you doing today, Jim?
I'm doing fine, Nick, and how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Little groggy today.
A little groggy today?
Yeah, the kids are keeping us up a little bit at night.
Yeah.
But about an hourly basis. But, you know, this too is part of life.
And this too shall pass.
Exactly.
It'll take a little while, but it goes by quickly. We're in new digs here.
Yeah, we are. We, for those watching in the video, we set up one of our downstairs rooms to be our new recording studio rather than the upstairs stage. And so we're hoping to eventually replace a few items of the set, but for now we've just transferred the set downstairs to a quieter location. So it feels very industrial recording with all the black walls.
Yeah, the black walls. It's set up relatively permanently too. So opportunity for maybe some more things coming out of St. Therese here.
Yeah, no, it's rather exciting. If anyone ever listening to this podcast wants to, potentially give us some new furniture, that would be awesome. But no pressure there, of course.
Yeah. Well, maybe just call first before we
call
end up
first,
with piles of old couches out the back door, which we have to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah, one of those. Well, we'll sort that one out when it comes. So for today, Jim, I was thinking we've just come out of what's called the Emmaus Retreat here at St. Therese. So the Emmaus Retreat is a week-long silent retreat with various community teachings given in the mornings, conferences, all the rest. And it got me thinking because we use the road to Emmaus narrative in the scriptures as the model for it. So I thought that would be a very good thing for us to talk about today. Yeah.
It's a beautiful model and certainly one that's been very close to my heart for a long time as a template for accompaniment, a model for accompaniment for the process of encounter with Christ, ongoing conversion, and beautifully resonates with the notion of pilgrimage. The pilgrimage in the short term, be it a week-long retreat, or the more practical, tangible pilgrimage of actually a journey from point A to point B, or the more long-term, the lifetime's journey to our Father's house.
Yeah, no, it's one of those... It's one of those narratives in the scriptures which the first time I actually encountered it, I gleaned over it rather quickly. And then it has this quality of sort of sticking in your mind. And you begin to percolate and contemplate it for a long time. And before you know it, you realized you're not the only one who's done that. It actually has quite a rich commentary in the church. And there's a lot of spiritual writers and even current...
Very much contemporary.
Yeah.
In the church, it's a model that's being used quite deliberately and intentionally, and it's lovely.
Yeah, so it might be good for us then to just sort of like overview a little bit of the narrative of where it actually finds itself in the scriptures.
Yeah.
And where it's situated. So it's actually situated at near the end of Luke's gospel. In fact, Luke 24 is the last chapter, and it begins on verse 13. It's right situated after Jesus' resurrection and his appearances to Mary Magdalene and also Peter running to the tomb and looking inside and seeing the linen cloth neatly folded off to the side. So it's immediately after this that we find the road to Emmaus narrative.
And this is all in the context of these immediate post-resurrection sightings and encounters with Christ.
Exactly. In fact, the road to Emmaus narrative starts off by saying, that very day.
Yeah.
So it's the sense of immediacy, this very quick, sudden appearance. So the actual narrative is that there's these two disciples who are leaving Jerusalem, and they're discussing things on the way. In fact, one of the translations of the words even has the connotation of they weren't just discussing, they were possibly bickering.
I remember encountering one scripture scholar that had said there's textual evidence that might indicate that it was actually a husband and wife, which would account for the bickering then, I would think. But
yeah, well, there's, very possibly. I kind of like that image because, we've all seen husband and wife bicker to an extent, and it's like this age-old familiar bickering.
And that's it. It's a familiar. It's not only in a family, but there's a familiar understanding of what bickering actually looks like. It's not just discussing and grumbling, but there's a certain quality to it.
Yeah, exactly.
There's an undercurrent of love and acceptance, but yeah.
Yeah, it's like they're not going anywhere, but these are age-old problems they're bringing up, So anyways, there are these two disciples. One is for sure named Cleopas, I believe. And the other person is left unnamed, but it is speculated on some scholars that it could be his wife. or it could be another disciple. I like the image of it being his wife, but So they're heading out to a little town called Emmaus, which is approximately 60 stadia, the Greek says, or about 7 miles.
7 miles, yeah.
Outside of Jerusalem. And on the way, the scriptures tell us that Jesus drew near and he heard them arguing or bickering or discussing, and he basically asked them, "So what are you talking about? What's going on?" And they asked him basically along the lines of, are you the only one in these parts who has not heard the events that have happened in
I
Jerusalem?
love that expression. Here they are. Jesus, the notion of Jesus drawing near, but then that statement, are you the only one? He was the principal character. So
Yeah,
you just don't know that
exactly.
yet. Yeah.
You can almost imagine this little crooked smile on the corner of Jesus's face. It's like, pray tell, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's
I just know in my own life how often that's my relationship with the Lord. It's like, are you the only one that doesn't know what's going on in my life right now? Of all of the things that I'm struggling
saying
with.
it to the Lord? Oh, yeah. I know. It's pretty hard when you embrace a victim mentality. Anyways, but yeah, so Jesus basically pries them a little further, and they tell that Jesus, this great prophet named Jesus, was put to death, and they had great hopes for him, but that they indicated, these hopes had been dashed along. So then Jesus all of a sudden steps into a bit of a harsher tone. He says, he basically calls them fools, and he says, foolish men and slow to believe.
Slow to believe.
Yeah, that's the phraseology.
Yeah.
And then
just to interject for a moment, it's an interesting thing too, I find, when I'm reading that passage, to see how we had hoped. There's that sense of this truncation that's happened. We had hoped. Something's been lost. And even in what they they're hoping for. Sorry, a little bit of a technical glitch there, but we'll just keep rolling. So the sense of we had hoped, but even what they're saying they'd hoped for, it's like, this was only days before that, this is the Messiah, this is the Holy One of God. And now what is, he was a prophet, a teacher. So there's been this kind of reduction in what the expectations are. The sense of a loss of hope, a loss of dreams, and a loss of desire.
And it's even interesting viewing that against the context of if it was husband and wife bickering. There's this age-old familiarity we have with the husband and wife bickering. They're probably talking about not just these events, but a long history of various other issues being brought into play. So I think it draws out really nicely the fact that these were not just casual dreams. In a sense, I think it's actually talking about the messianic hope of Israel.
Sure, yeah.
Because, how many Israelites in those times had been bickering about who was the Messiah, And so I think that in this husband and wife, we're actually seeing something of the wider problem being represented. And I think it's not just a crisis in terms of, a life decision, like a midlife crisis or something. I think it actually gets into the question of faith, almost a crisis of faith. They're like the Jewish people were actually in a phase where they were trying to cling on to their last hopes, because the occupation of the Romans on them, and et cetera, was not just a geographical, political problem, it was a theological one.
Yeah.
And so I think that, if we view it in the context of that familiarity, that bickering, and then our hopes are lost, I think we can see a bit of a deeper story that's happening.
And it seems there's another story there too. Like there's the hopes lost in the immediate. We had come to Jerusalem, hailing Christ as a king, and it's just the hopes dashed in this moment, the moment of the passion, the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's, as you're pointing out, the hopes of a people, Israel, embodied in these two. And I think there's also the event of the passion and death of Jesus casts a long shadow back over those life stories of those individual disciples. So there's the moment of what's happened in the past few days. There is the moment in salvation history, but there's also the moment in that lifetime of discipleship, of waiting and coming. And I can only imagine how the shadow of those dashed hopes would cast long back, into their very early lives as disciples, as so often the challenges in my life cast a shadow back.
Oh yeah, that's a little too true. I'm still pretty young, but there's even my troubles now. They tend to cast a fairly long shadow. So anyways, continuing with the narrative, Jesus then says, "Oh, foolish of heart and slow to believe." And then he says something very curious. He said, "Was it not necessary that the Messiah, the Christ, should suffer these things?" And so he actually goes forward and then interprets the scriptures all according to himself and telling them about himself in the scriptures. And in this way, we see Christ as actually the first exegete, the first Christian exegete. We go there because Christ went there first. And so he tells to them how the whole story of Israel was actually anticipating someone like Christ.
Through Moses and all of the prophets.
Through Moses and all of the prophets. And of course Moses was the one who had given them the old law. And then the prophets had all, especially the later day prophets, they had all been anticipating something incredibly new, this bridegroom analogy, or bridegroom imagery, that there was going to be this marriage of some sort, that God was going to woo back the Israelite people. And so there's a lot of, in that interpretive lens, he's actually taking these images and showing them how, well, we're looking at it this way, but if we shift our perspective, we look at it another way. And I think that's incredibly rich, because what Christ was doing, therefore, is he wasn't just telling them an abstract story, he was telling them their story in many ways. Because the deeper you actually look into the Old Testament and the story of the people of Israel, you'll notice that these are actually stories that correlate to various points in our life. We've all been a Jacob wrestling with God at one point. We've all been Sarah, who has actually laughed at God in one way. We've all been a Job who, though we don't deny God, we do question him quite a bit. And so I find that that's actually a really important part of the story, where he actually goes back and retells the story.
Yeah, it's almost, very clearly, from what we were saying earlier, is those three moments that have been this reduction of hope, this loss, this slippage in hope. He's speaking into that. It's the, was it not necessary, specific to the most recent events of the past few days. It's the, was it not necessary in light of all salvation history, but then also, as you're pointing out, salvation history in the light also of the individual lives of these disciples. So like the sun rising, chasing away that long shadow passed back over their lives.
Yeah. No, it's funny because, the image of light and dark does play a big part in this narrative, and maybe we'll touch on that in a little bit. So anyways, they're continuing along the road, and they are continuing to talk with Christ, and then it comes to almost like a fork in the road. I forget exactly how it phrases it, but they're going one way to Emmaus, and then Jesus seems to be going another direction. And then they say, "Oh, please, would you not join us for a meal? Join us for supper," kind of thing.
It's getting late in the day.
It's getting
Here's
late
your play
in the day.
on light and dark.
Light and dark, yeah.
He was intending to move on, to keep going forward, yeah.
Exactly. So then Jesus pretty much accommodates them. So then they go into accommodations, and they start sharing a meal. And so then Jesus took the bread, said the prayers, broke it, and all of a sudden they saw him. They recognized him. Their eyes were opened. And they realized it was the Christ. And
that's a formula, isn't it? That he took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it. And that formula is indicative of
Eucharist.
The Eucharist.
Yeah, the consecration of the Eucharist. So, and then of course, and then mysteriously he disappears. But then the two disciples look to each other and say, "Were our hearts not burning within us while he talked with us on the road?" And then the crazy part is that they actually get up and leave back to Jerusalem from whence they came, about 7 miles away. But we had been told that it was late in the day. So it looks like they went back in the nighttime to Jerusalem, where they proclaimed to the early Christian community that we just saw Jesus risen from the dead. In which case, and then Peter says, "Yeah, we did too."
Yeah. This lovely counterpoint as they travel from Jerusalem to Emmaus of being in the presence of light, but they're being in darkness. They're being in darkness in the presence of the light. On the return from Emmaus to Jerusalem, into the darkness, in light. So the first half of the story, they're surrounded by light, but their minds are darkened. Their faith is darkened in the presence of Christ the light. And now with with the presence of Christ, the light rekindled in their hearts and those hopes, they head into the darkness to carry that light back to Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's totally intriguing, like the lineup of those things. Like, and there's even some Old Testament passages, like the word of the Lord is a lamp unto my feet. You know, by actually going and trusting in the word, you actually are able to encounter all obstacles. You know, you don't know necessarily the full path, but you can trust in that. Also very interesting, the whole buildup of dialogos, the word, dialoguing with the word about the scriptures, you know, coming to see the word, capital W, behind the words of scripture. And then the climax or the conclusion, the consummation in the Eucharist. There have been quite a few church fathers who have mentioned that this looks like a lot like a retelling of what actually happens to us in the context of the Mass.
Yeah, the liturgy of the Word.
Yeah.
Which leads to the liturgy of the Eucharist, which leads to the Missio.
The Missio, the proceeding forth. Yeah. So it's a very deep narrative. But the question, of course, is, you know, Jim, this is one that you found particularly important for your time as ministering to youth and also in formation and stuff like that. You've been sharing quite a bit about the road to Emmaus this year at St. Therese, as with almost every year I've been here, actually. And it's only become more and more, not exaggerated, emphasized in the life of the church recently. So I was wondering if you could possibly give us some insight.
Yeah, no, I'd be very glad to. It's, I would say that the account of the disciples on the road to Emmaus and their encounter with Jesus, probably my favorite scripture, my favorite passage. As you were saying earlier, it's a relatively simple account. It's one that we're very familiar with. And I love these places in the scripture where you have this relatively simple account that the more you read it, the deeper it gets. It's like a well. You know, at first glance, it seems pretty small, pretty superficial, but you realize just how deep it goes, and deeper and deeper and deeper. I think particularly in these times of Pope Francis and the emphasis on dialogue, on the art of accompaniment, the emphasis on encounter, in light of one of our other favorites, Gaudium et Spes 22, that Christ, the presence of Christ, the encounter with Christ reveals the truth of ourselves to ourselves. And we need that deep and abiding personal encounter. And the personal, I don't mean that private encounter, that it's mine and not yours, but personal, meaning it's an encounter of persons. It's engaging intellect and will and the call to a transformation and the call to a depth of relationship, which is essentially the communion of persons. So Emmaus, the notions and the theme, the flow of it just resonates so deeply with this notion of encounter. With the disciples journeying along together with a sense of desperation, despondency, disappointment, discouragement. Those are very familiar things to any of us. Even as disciples of Christ, we wrestle with that. What we do with it makes all of the difference. You know, I think of Saint Therese, who would say discouragement is not of God, and strive to be very careful and cautious of discouragement, and really in those moments of discouragement to turn to the Lord. So here we see in this account, in the moment of discouragement, that Jesus actually draws alongside to first encounter and accompany, to the drawing near, to walk with, and to listen. The listening is so important. It's something that Pope Francis emphasizes, even to the point of suggesting that listening should be recognized as a charism by the Church. Interesting. The charism of listening, and so how often that is the need to be heard, to be listened to, especially young people feeling that need to be validated and affirmed just by being listened to. And so we see the progression of the encounter to the revelation of Christ that actually allows the person to know what they're supposed to do. And so we move from the Gaudium et Spes 22 through the journey to the Gaudium et Spes 24, that making the disinterested gift of self, the disciples heading off in mission. So certainly the Emmaus motif has been something that's very resonated deeply in the work that I've done in encountering. But it's beautiful to see how it's actually becoming a more foundational model for the art of accompaniment as taught by the Church. Certainly in the Synod of Bishops on youth, faith, and vocational discernment.
Road to Emmaus made a big appearance there.
The Road to Emmaus, in the context of the conversations, it became the scripture that they used as the landing point, as the foundation for all of their discussions, to the point where in the final document, the whole document is broken into three main parts that all follow along the account of Emmaus. And Emmaus is suggested as a model for youth ministry in this day and age. You would see, I think it's paragraph 4 from the final document of the Synod of Bishops on youth, faith, and vocational discernment, that would actually be translated directly into Christus Vivit, which is the post-synodal apostolic exhortation from Pope Francis on his letter to young people. And I think that is paragraph 237. And in that, it just encapsulates, from the introduction of the final document, encapsulates the progression that is seen in Emmaus. And Pope Francis, drawing from the Synod of Bishops, recognizes 3 movements that is happening in Emmaus. And I think it's so beautiful because we see this happening in the account of Emmaus, but this is the model for our encounter with one another. And certainly the church is proposing it for the work with young people, and I think that it has a very special vitality and vibrancy and applicability to the journeying with young people and young adults. I would say so too for any disciple of any age, and not just in our accompaniment with, but also how it applies. Like I find I apply this notion of Emmaus to my own life, in my own personal prayer and the sacraments. But the 3 stages that Pope Francis recognizes, the first is the stage of recognition. There's recognition, and that is the Christ drawing near, the disciples pouring their hearts out to one another, and then with this stranger, they're pouring their hearts out, and the stranger is listening. So Christ is listening. Christ, who is not known to the disciples, just listening and hearing the frustrations, the discouragements, the disappointments. And in the sharing of the hearts, the disciples are able to actually come to recognize where their disappointments and discouragements are. How often
they come to greater self-clarity.
Yeah, self-clarity, self-awareness. And how often has it been that you find that, working with the students here, somebody will come in to talk with you, and half an hour of listening, and they're going, wow, that feels great. It's like, glad I could help you, and you've done nothing but
it's funny because I talked to a Christian counselor one time, and he said, half my job is just listening, and people tend to figure their own problems out. And I thought that was actually a good, healthy sign of psychology, because I know for myself, half my issues I get tangled in a knot, and it's only when I actually start talking about it that the knot, I actually see the knot, and I'm like, well, there's this string and this string and this string in there. Where are these coming from? And so half of the cure is in the listening. At least I find. Yeah,
the first half of the cure, that's just the diagnostics, the recognition. And so that's what it is. Even more so, if that's just in the presence of a counselor or a friend, how much more so in the hidden presence of Christ?
Yeah.
So somebody who is listening while they themselves are grounded in prayer and being in the presence of Christ, and they themselves being the presence of Christ. So it's Christ who is actually listening in the accompaniment there. So that moment of recognition, that's the first part. Then there's that hinge of the, and I don't know that Christ was necessarily being condemning in this at all. I think he was like, oh, okay, I'll explain it one more time. But maybe now you'll get it. And certainly they do.
Yeah. I love it because I think it was St. Augustine who said that the scriptures are meant to be challenging to us. It doesn't mean that God hates us or anything like that, or God is like fed up with us. It's more like it's trying to draw our attention. When it uses maybe a harsher consonant or harsher word here and there, it's really basically saying, pay attention to this. This is important, what I'm about to say. And I found that more and more. So the scriptures are actually designed to challenge us. And it's a good challenge because what it does is it actually brings us into a deeper encounter of his mercy, of his divine condescension, his stooping to us, like a father stoops to child. So anyways.
And I think of that disposition of heart of a parent stooping to a child, that disposition of heart that would be, oh, little one, all right, let me explain it again. And that disposition of heart. So certainly this is what Christ does with the disciples. Having listened and heard, they're coming to that place of recognition of just how profound their disappointments and discouragements and frustrations. They've told Jesus their story, their version of accounts. So we move into the second part, what is identified by Pope Francis and Christus Vivit as interpretation. And so this is the interpretation in the light of Christ, as Christ begins to break open the scriptures and reveal everything from Moses and the prophets, the liturgy of the word. And so the interpretation, that leads for the rest of the journey. And I would say even into the encounter and the meal and the breaking of the bread, when they actually do, in the light of Christ, that huge interpretation that happens there. This is what was going on, and did not our hearts burn? So all of that interpretation. So it's almost as if through recognition, the disciples are telling their story to Christ. And in the telling of their story, their human revelation, their frustrations and difficulties and challenges, and the hopes that are underlying those dashed hopes, and the courage to actually express underlying the discouragement, and the optimism, even in the face of some dire pessimism, that is still there because they're willing to share, willing to talk. So that recognition, then the interpretation through the breaking open of the Word, and the breaking open of the sacrament, the breaking open of the Eucharist in that case, the understanding of Christ, so that interpretation. So in that point, the disciples having told their story, now Jesus tells their story back in a very real way, reframes the narrative in the context of the truth, which is himself, the way, the truth, and the life. He says, this is actually what's been going on. It's like the words of Jesus to Peter at the Last Supper in John, I think it's 13, verse 7. I was just praying with this the other day when he's washing their feet, and Peter's objecting, and he says, now you do not know what I'm doing, but later you will understand. So that's almost the first half of Emmaus and the second half. And then finally, Jesus disappears from their sight. Their eyes are opened, and he disappears from their sight. That beautiful apparent contradiction, but we so often experience that with the light of faith coming on. And we recognize that Christ has been with us all along. And this is the third point that Pope Francis speaks about, and that's to choose. So to recognize, recognition, interpretation in the light of Christ, and then the choice that has to happen. And we see this beautiful encounter with the human person and the divine person of Jesus. The human person, there's the gradual moving from the darkness of the darkening of the intellect and the weakening of the will through the enlightening of the intellect through interpretation, and then the strengthening of the will by Christ, nourished by the word and by the sacraments. And then from that goes the missio, the choice. Of course, Pope Francis always framing this in the context of discernment as the good Jesuit that he is, the discernment that is called for. So that beautiful flow.
Yeah, no, and there's a lot there. There's a few things that you said that really got me thinking. You mentioned pessimism and optimism. We often are caught in our hearts are often pessimistic and stuff like that. And it's funny because in the telling, in the recognition, are the telling of our story to Christ or to another. It's funny because in the telling, though our hearts are often loaded by pessimism, I was just reflecting how the telling is actually an act of hope. Because if it really was as pessimistic and as dark as it was, there would be no point in the telling. So it's interesting that Christ actually evokes them in that way. It's like, what's wrong? And then they are like, well, this is what's going on. And it's in the telling and the description and stuff. They actually have to go in and relook at it in a different way. Or they're actually even asking for it to be told in a different way.
There's an invitation in the sharing of their frustrations, There's a couple of distinctions I think it would be worth making too. I do mention optimism and pessimism, but recognize that these are human attitudes. These are not the virtues, the virtue of hope. Hope and optimism are a very different thing. Optimism literally is just seeing things in a good light. But that's an important part of being a human, how we choose to see something. Now, inspired by the virtue of hope, that's a whole different kettle of fish. But I think the notion of wrestling between optimism and pessimism, optimism is what Monty Python will put, always look on the bright side of life.
Bright side of life, yeah. How did Monty Python make its way into the road to Emmaus? I'm not sure.
We just slipped it in there. Anyway, that optimism is important. But I think also recognizing that while there may be that wrestling of optimism and pessimism, of discouragement with hope and all of those things, we recognize that it's very different from just straight on grumbling even if the disciples were bickering. They're seeking to understand. They're just asking the great why.
Well, and these are restless hearts. These are not complacent hearts. They're restless. They're wrestling with the thing, and they're not content to just stay immobile. They're actually trying to figure things out. And they're, and I think that, in a sense, there's this great commentary on their heading away from Jerusalem. There's almost this crisis of faith that's being evoked there, because Jerusalem is the center of faith. And in fact, on that day in Jerusalem, there was actually one of the concluding feasts of the Passover was occurring. So it would have been proper for the Jews to stay. So they're leaving on this fundamental day, But the important thing is, I think that there's a commentary that even as they were leaving, they were still in motion. They were still, in a way, trying to sort things out. And I think that has even given me a bit of hope whenever I deal with, like, say, the black sheep in the family, or the friend who's going through a rough patch and might even leave the faith for a time. Because if I see the heart still wrestling, I know it's still alive. In the words of G.K. Chesterton, only a dead thing goes along with the stream.
Right.
And so I think that, when Christ steps into that and he sees that wrestling and he actually invites the wrestling to become a dialogue, and there's actually that willingness to do so, then that's a great sign of hope.
And there yet resides a spark. I think that's an important distinction as well. There is that restlessness. It is a crisis in faith, but that's not that there is not faith. There's something. There needs to be the rekindling, and it's like that scripture of, the bruised reed he will not break, the flickering flame he will not extinguish. There's going to be a fostering of that, which I think stands in a bit of counterpoint to another time when we hear about disciples grumbling. And that would be John 6. Now, of course, we're comparing Luke and John, different accounts, but I think that there's a progression that is similar.
They certainly complement.
In John 6, in the Bread of Life discourse, you have Jesus who's actually teaching about the Eucharist. It's leaning into that, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. But we see the progression of grumbling. It starts off with the grumbling, and then 10 verses later or so, it's the murmuring among themselves, and then 10 verses later or so, the disciples are leaving. They're walking away from Jesus, in a sense, walking away from Jerusalem, but they're not walking towards the Eucharist. They're deliberately walking away from it and from the restoration of hope. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, while they may be walking away from Jerusalem, Christ, in his resurrection, has come alongside and is with them, perhaps more present than ever, in the opening of the Word and ultimately leading them to the Eucharist. And I think the difference there may be that there's still the flame of faith, the desire, the seeking, the questioning. Whereas in the disciples that would be leaving Jesus, there's more than a crisis in faith.
There was a decision.
There's a decision.
Well, and if we look at the word crisis, it actually comes from the same word meaning to decide. So in that sense, any crisis of faith is a decision point. Am I going to continue or not? And actually, it's funny that you mentioned John 6, because at the end of that narrative, Jesus turns to the apostles with Peter at the front and says, "Will you leave me also?" And then Peter says...
Peter's great response,
oh my
which
gosh.
is, "Yes, Lord, I understand exactly what you're talking about. You're going to be giving us eventually, the words of consecration, and we will do that by virtue of our priestly ordination in you, and it'll be the great act of transubstantiation." No, I understand entirely what you're saying, Lord.
That's the 2020 hindsight response. What Peter actually said was, "Lord, to whom else will we go?
You have the
words of everlasting life."
Yeah.
And so I thought it was just a brilliant response by Peter, because it was actually like this fundamental movement of like, I don't even pretend to understand what you're doing, but I have tasted something that is good. And you could even question whether there was some spiritual heartburn going on there. And
you're stealing my line, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I really am. I wanted to beat you to it.
Spiritual heartburn.
Spiritual heartburn. I really like it. But it's interesting, too, because if you actually look at the road to Emmaus, Peter is not absent from the narrative, because the whole context for Emmaus is the women at the tomb. And then the very first line before the Emmaus narrative is actually Peter stooping in and looking at the folded linens in the tomb. And then he returned, it's actually a bit of an ambiguous phrase, because on one level it could mean that he returned to the upper room, or he reflected to himself and then returned to the upper room. But there's actually another translation, which is, it says, Peter came to himself and then returned, kind of thing. Which I thought was very intriguing, because it's almost like the road to Emmaus steps from that moment of Peter coming to himself. And then it's like, okay, here's another story illustrating Peter's experience of looking at the folded linen.
And then at the end, when they come back to Jerusalem, the first thing that they're met with is he's appeared to Simon as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Where if Peter had come to himself at the beginning, here's Christ who'd come to Peter. It's almost like Peter, throughout all of these narratives, is this anchor or
the rock,
a foundation stone.
And there's like there's quite a few meanings to the word rock in this. You know, like rock is the foundation of the church, the ecclesial authority, and all the rest. But I think that there's also, frankly, this is the foundation of the personal faith of all believers. When we actually look at Peter at the beginning and look at Peter at the end, we see that this narrative is almost describing, yes, the individual movements of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, but it also is kind of, by capping it in Peter and Peter, it's actually saying this is a universal movement, you know, that all of us in some way are meant to go through.
Within the church.
Within the church. So I found that was really interesting. That, of course, is me just speaking from my reflections, but I'd be very interested to see if there's anyone else.
Yeah, it's good.
It's also interesting to note the words, were our hearts not burning within us? I thought it was really good how you drew out, you know, they didn't really know fully at that point. Their eyes were not yet opened, but their hearts were burning, and so they continued in this invitation with Jesus. In a sense, though the day was still light, it was growing darker, and their hearts were going lighter. And I thought that was really intriguing, because St. Ignatius of Loyola talks about something called felt knowledge. My spiritual director, who's a Jesuit, he had this conversation with me one time. He's like, there's like, you know, this categorical knowledge that we have, but then there's also this knowledge that, frankly, you sense it. Like, you sense something's just around the corner, and you actually have this excitement. You have this this actual passion that is leading you forward in a way. And according to my spiritual director, you have to pay attention to those moments, because this is where the Holy Spirit is actually speaking in a peculiar language to yourself. And so this is a form of knowledge. It's an introductory form of knowledge, but it's actually this kind of knowledge that is pointing towards a deeper encounter. And then there's going to be a fundamental revelation later. So I thought it was really interesting how the narrative frames it that way, because they did not yet know where everything was going, but they had seen something and they sensed something, and there was this passion, which is not just of human origin, it's this burning, you know.
And it's almost a foreshadowing, but foreshadowing wouldn't be the right word, a precursor of the Pentecost moment, because it is that hearts burning, that burning hearts, which Luke would then write about in Acts with the actual Pentecost event with the tongues of fire falling upon that in flaming hearts. But it also, as we're discussing, it calls to mind the notion of the Shekinah glory, the glory of God. It's always seen as flame, fire, the pillar of fire.
The pillar of fire and cloud,
These
fire at
theophanies.
night, cloud in the day.
So, you know, it's a bit of an odd fit, but just in light of Saint Irenaeus saying that, you know, the glory of God is man fully alive, and seeing these disciples being brought to life in the presence of Christ as Christ reveals them to themselves and makes their destiny clear, and then invites them to go and make a disinterested gift of self to others. And there's this increasing kindling of that glory of God in the hearts of the disciples that want to go and proclaim and profess and claim the truth.
So, you know, we could keep going for another 40 minutes just talking about how to unpack all the various levels of meaning, because we both tend to be long-winded. But I thought, like, for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so of the podcast, it might be good for us to kind of draw some maybe practical applications of this, you know. I think the 3 stages of Pope Francis articulates are actually quite significant. So what were they again? They were
recognition,
interpretation,
and choice.
Okay, sounds good. So in one sense, this applies to us at every single Mass, you know, when we go to Mass. But where else would you say this kind of applies in life?
Two places that I would suggest. One is how I integrate it into my own life. and my own journey with the Lord as I'm making this pilgrimage through life to heaven. And how often, when I'm faced by the apparent paradoxes of life and the challenges of life, of bringing them to the Lord and recognizing that there is that movement of recognition, just being open, honest with myself, honest with God, not hiding things. How often we try and hide things from God as if He is not aware of what's going on.
Yeah, it's always kind of strange when we try and do that, hey?
Yeah,
I say
so-
we because I do it too.
So the openness, the vulnerability, the honesty about circumstances, and not being afraid of just being human and having frustrations and difficulties and apparent conundrums, and being honest with the Lord about that. And often the Lord through a community. So that might be conversation with a good friend, or spiritual direction, or just listening in the context of life. That's important. Those are the disciples, and allowing the Lord to be in the mix of that. And then coming to interpretation, being able to really listen to what Jesus is saying, specifically through the Word and through the sacraments, those primary channels of encounter with Christ. And those are extremely important. And then actually getting on and doing it. It's like that, choosing to do it is one thing, then getting on and actually acting on that choice, like that joke that was Father Gerard Cooper, dear priest friend of ours here at St. Therese, mentioned in one of his homilies about the 10 frogs sitting on the log, and 9 of them decided to jump off. How many frogs are sitting on the log?
I don't recall.
10. Because deciding to do it and actually doing it are two entirely different things. So part of choice is actually getting up from the table, heading back out into the darkness and retracing your steps to Jerusalem. And interesting is, to Jerusalem, the very place where we had hopes and where those hopes had been diminished or dashed, but we go back to proclaim. So I find that in my own life, this kind of circular movement of grace and growth. And it's not so much circular as it is spiral. And then, of course, the other application of this is in the work that we do. The model that Pope Francis is proposing for working with young people. And I see the time at St. Therese, the 9-month formation program, is a long journey to Emmaus. And the 3 trimesters actually do clearly fall in their themes to recognition, interpretation, and choice, with the themes at St. Therese being obedience and abandonment, just coming to recognize, what have I brought here, where am I at? And the Emmaus Retreat being dropped like a little microcosm of that encounter into the end of that first trimester. The second being confidence in communion, which is the growing in communion with God, where we start to interpret things in Christ, in the light of Christ. And then discernment and mission, clearly about making a choice and how do I translate what I've experienced here in this time of formation into life. And then in Emmaus, we see this movement. And I think you can take those 3 stages of recognition, interpretation, and choice, and you can break them down into smaller stages. So even that initial encounter would be part. That drawing near could be seen as a stage and step in itself. The whole process of listening, of entering into dialogue, could be seen as those mini steps in that first stage. So the process of Emmaus, of the Emmaus Retreat, we try to lead the students and accompany them through a 5-day kind of silent retreat. There's big chunks of silence in the retreat. There's noise, but overall it's a still retreat. That's the way I would describe it. But that facilitating encounter with Jesus to lead through the recognition of what my story is, where as a disciple of Christ at this point in my life, what are the challenges? Where have I been disappointed, discouraged? Where are the bumps and bruises and hurts in life that have diminished my hope, my faith, my love? And then encountering Christ, and specifically through the Word and through the sacraments. And then how does that translate into life? And I hope for the students that going through this 5 days becomes a pattern that they would continue in their own personal lives. So much at the heart of it, though, is also drawing from Sherry Waddell's understanding that she mentions in Forming Intentional Disciples about the 2 sides of faith. There's the virtue of faith, the objective capacity that we have, but then the active faith that is necessary, that personal choice that the proper term is unbinds the graces of the sacraments, because we can receive a sacrament and have it bound. So very deliberately in the context of the retreat, but also in our own lives, we can say, Lord, break open the Word that I might see you in the Word. And so throughout the retreat, and we can do this in our personal prayer, of inviting the Lord through Lectio Divina and those practices to really reveal himself in the Word and help to make the meaning of his life and my life much clearer. But also the breaking open of the sacraments. And so in the retreat, we do this with the 4 principal sacraments that the students have received: baptism, penance, reconciliation, the Eucharist, and confirmation, so that there can be an open flowing of the graces for discipleship. And it's very beautiful, very subtle, very gentle, but that breaking open of word and sacrament is powerful. So yeah, that's a slightly long-winded micro nutshell of what we're doing, but it's a big thing.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks for giving us an insight into how, like the retreat and stuff, and St. Therese, the way we try to apply Emmaus here.
Yeah. And thanks for your patience in hearing what you already know.
Oh, you know, you learn something new every time. No, and I think for myself, like, I often think of, like, you know, how does Emmaus apply to someone who, for example, works in a restaurant or a plumber or a politician? And I think there's almost two ways we can view someone like that fitting their Emmaus into their lives, which is to view, number one, themselves as the disciples going to Emmaus, because there is this need for recognition, for
interpretation,
and then the choice in each of our lives in that spiritual dimension, dialogue with the Word and Sacrament. And then I think that there's also this level at evangelization, which is we are called to be Christs to others. And I think that we can also step into the narrative and see ourselves as taking the position of Christ. Not being Christ as in the only Son of God, you know, but recognizing that the call of the Christian is to follow in the Secula Christi, the footsteps of Christ, you know. So in our workspaces, in our lives, with our families, to provide this space where I ask Christ to give me the grace to recognize someone else, to interpret, to be a sounding board, to be a mirror to that person, and then to help facilitate their choice. Not in a way to destroy their agency or usurp their agency, but to bring them to themselves, you know, with this incredible loving movement of grace, but also detachment as well. You know, Christ, in a way, makes a powerful demand, but he doesn't use force. You know, as soon as they recognize him, he disappears and he gives them the space for the choice. You know, and I think that that is a general meta archetype, if you will, of how we can kind of apply it. And I think for each of us, it's going to look a little different.
Sure. Yeah. It occurs to me another way that could be very simply applied, obviously, is the reception of the sacraments themselves. The next time we go to Mass, of recognizing there can be the recognition, the interpretation, and the choice. It's clearly following the form of the liturgy. So we could actually do a 1.5 hour Emmaus just each time we're going to the liturgy through appropriate preparation and celebration.
And I think that's the beauty of reading the readings first. Because if you actually have the time to read the readings and then be like, well, so what? What's sticking off the page to me?
And maybe even before that little bit of stillness, just to say, this is what I'm bringing here.
Yeah.
This is what I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, and if you're distracted from the reading, well, guess what? I think the disciples on the road to Emmaus were distracted too.
Yeah.
So then it's in the telling of their story that Christ may be able to tell something about your story with the same reading that we read every day at Mass that the rest of the church reads.
Yeah.
So that's the lesson of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish.
And I think that there's also another way that the kind of cycle of Emmaus, that pattern of recognition, interpretation, and choice, could be done on a moment-to-moment basis too. That would actually be very healthy for emotional life and mental stability in our spiritual life. Is when I start to become self-aware enough that something's rattling, you know, I'm wrestling with impatience or frustrations, just to say in that moment even, just stop. And this could be done by the plumber, the mechanic, the parent, the teacher anywhere.
Yeah.
Just to stop for just even a couple of minutes and just say, okay, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? What am I feeling? What's going on? What am I frustrated by? That moment of recognition.
What's my story?
What's my story
What's
right
the
now?
narrative?
What do I believe is actually happening? What do I think is happening? What do I feel is happening? So often it's feeling. And then to say, Lord, step into this moment right now. Come, bring your light and help me to understand it. And in the light of Christ, look at it new. And then to make a choice. Well, how do I want to see this? And strengthened by Christ, who's entered into this moment, what do I want to do? I think that beautiful thing could happen in the course of, you know, 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And what a transformative experience that could be in our days.
The beauty of that is I think that each of us, when we actually look at these moments where we see our own grapplings, is I think we are actually able to see that we're going to give the same response to Jesus that the disciples of Emmaus did, which is, you know, a great prophet, a great teacher has died, but are we viewing him as the Son of God? You know, are we actually in the depths of our hearts seeing him that way, you know? because and then there's this process of building up. What you're saying actually reminds me. Occasionally, I used to work in the restaurant industry as a server, and occasionally when I was in a really busy shift and it was just too much, I would go off and do a bathroom break. Really, I would just sit down on the toilet and just hold my head in my hands and be like, "Oh Lord, how am I going to deal with this one?" And it's funny because when I even said those words, "Oh Lord, how am I going to deal with this one?" And actually had the courage to pray a Come Holy Spirit prayer, I found I was actually able to come out with a bit of a slightly refreshed perspective, and usually was able to turn around an evening pretty easily. Well, no, not easily, pretty simply. Let's put it that way.
Simple, yeah, simple and easy, two very different things.
Yeah, very much.
Well, it reminding me also of just that powerful and beautiful, simple proclamation of the gospel at the very beginning of Christus Vivit, what Christus Vivit means. Christ is alive, He is our hope. And that's a living reality right now in the midst of the trials and tribulations and turmoil of life. Christ is alive, and He is our hope.
He's our hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a very good spot to maybe close this one off on. Yeah, but thank you very much, Jim, for sharing all of your insights on Emmaus.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing yours.
Yeah. It's a deeply impactful narrative, and I think it's worthwhile to return to that often. So thanks everyone for tuning in to A Little Wayward's podcast, where this is where we do little very well.
Indeed, and in all circumstances of life, remember, Christ is alive,
and He is
our
hope.
hope.